I'm a park ranger in Oregon, stationed near Crater Lake. Most of my job involves guiding tourists and dealing with minor emergencies. But last fall, I experienced something I'll never forget. It started with a call from a hiker who reported hearing screams near a remote section of the park. I grabbed my gear and headed out. It was late afternoon, and the sun was sinking behind the trees. The trail was overgrown, barely visible. About 2 miles in, I found something strange. A backpack sitting in the middle of the path. It was covered in dirt, as if it had been there for weeks. Inside were a wallet, some snacks, and a phone with a dead battery. The ID belonged to a man named Peter Wallace, who had been reported missing 6 months earlier. I radioed it in, but the signal was weak. That's when I heard it, a faint voice calling for help. "Hello," I shouted, turning in circles to locate the source. The voice sounded distant, like it was coming from deep in the woods. I followed it, leaving the trail behind. The trees grew thicker, the ground uneven. After about 30 minutes, I reached a clearing. In the center was an old rusted swing set, the kind you'd find in a 1950s playground. The swings moved gently, even though there was no wind. The voice came again, louder this time, but something about it felt wrong. It sounded almost rehearsed. "Please help me, I'm over here." I stepped closer, and that's when I saw the footprints. Bare human prints that started at the edge of the clearing and led straight into the swing set. They stopped abruptly, as if the person had been lifted into the air. The voice spoke again, but this time it was behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station. When I checked the park's history, I found reports of children disappearing in that area during the 1960s. Their bodies were never found. When we moved into the Victorian house in Ashbrook, it felt like stepping into a dream. It had everything we wanted: arched windows, a sprawling library, and a quiet charm that made it feel like it had been waiting for us. I was the one who pushed my parents to buy it. I'd been reading Gothic novels, and this house felt like it had leapt from one of those pages. The first few weeks were uneventful. Sure, the house creaked and groaned, but it was old. What did we expect? It wasn't until the first night I stayed up late studying that I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. The sound was soft, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I paused my music and strained to listen. "Help me," it whispered. I froze. My heart started hammering in my chest. I went downstairs to grab water, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But as I passed the living room, I saw it. The old mirror we'd bought with the house. A shadow moved in it. Not in the room, just the mirror. I told my dad the next morning, and he laughed it off. "Old houses have their quirks," he said. "You've been watching too many horror movies." I wanted to believe him, but when my little brother Sam started acting strange, I couldn't ignore it. Sam was 4, with a wild imagination, but even for him, something was off. He began talking to someone he called the boy. He'd sit in the library for hours, whispering and giggling like he was playing with an invisible friend. "Who's the boy?" I asked one day. Sam shrugged. "He's sad. He says we shouldn't be here." My stomach dropped. That night I decided to investigate. I stayed up until the whispers began again, louder this time. They were coming from the library. Armed with my phone flashlight, I crept down the hall. As I opened the door, the air turned icy. My breath fogged in front of me. Then I saw him, a pale, gaunt boy standing by the bookshelf, his eyes hollow and dark. He stared at me, lips moving, but the words were too faint to hear. When I stepped closer, he vanished, and every book on the shelf toppled to the floor. The final straw came when I woke up to find "Get Out" scrawled in the dust on my bedroom window. The letters weren't written by a finger, but looked like they'd been etched with claws. We left within a month. The house is still there, sitting empty. Sometimes I drive by and swear I see a boy standing at the window watching. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the isolation that feels freeing. Last fall, I decided to explore a trail I'd read about online. It wasn't on any official maps, but locals mentioned it in forums, a hidden gem tucked deep in the woods. The trailhead was unmarked, just a dirt path winding into the trees. About 3 miles in, I found a sign nailed to a tree. It looked ancient, the wood rotting, the paint faded. Do not follow the voices. I laughed. It had to be a joke, right? Some local trying to scare off tourists. Another mile in, I started hearing it. A faint voice calling my name. It stopped me dead in my tracks. No one knew I was there. I hadn't told anyone about this trip. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. It was my mom's voice. But my mom was over 100 miles away. "Jake, come here," it said. I don't know why, but I followed it. The voice led me off the trail, deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the trees thicker. After 20 minutes, I found a clearing. In the center was an old cabin, its roof caved in, windows shattered. The voice came from inside. I stepped onto the porch, and the wood groaned beneath my weight. Pushing the door open, I was hit by the smell of rot. The interior was empty except for a pile of old photographs scattered on the floor. My blood turned to ice. They were photos of me, taken from outside my apartment, at the grocery store, even inside my car. I didn't have time to think. The voice shifted, growing deeper, guttural. The air felt wrong, heavy. I ran. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and didn't stop driving until I was home. A week later, I read a news article about hikers disappearing in those woods. Some were found, most weren't. I don't hike alone anymore.